He is, by every metric your mother understands, a catch. He has a title that sounds important when you say it at dinner parties. He has a calendar that other people fight to get on. He has the kind of ambition that, from a distance, looks exactly like devotion to something, anyway. You assumed, in the beginning, that some of that something would eventually be you. That was the first thing you got wrong. From the outside, this is a success story. The ring photographed well. The house has a good address. People describe him as driven in the tone they reserve for compliments, and they describe you as lucky, which is a word that quietly does a lot of work. Nobody says it out loud, but the arrangement is understood. He builds the life, and you live in the parts of it he isn't using. And here's the strange part. You're not unhappy because he's a bad man. He's not cruel. He doesn't disappear into a bar or another bed. He disappears into something more socially respectable than either. A job that loves him back in measurable, deposited quarterly ways. You can't compete with a thing that pays the mortgage. You can only resent it on the nights you're too tired to be grateful. The hardest thing to explain to people is that nothing is wrong. There's no villain. There's just a man who answers one master, and a marriage that learns to schedule itself around the hours that master doesn't want. You didn't marry a stranger. You married a man with a second marriage he never mentioned in the vows. 1. The calendar is the marriage now. At some point, you stop asking when he'll be home and start checking a shared app. This is what intimacy becomes. A color-coded grid where your anniversary is a 30-minute block wedged between a flight and a sink. You learn to read the calendar like scripture because it's the most honest document in the house. The calendar never lies about what comes first. You tell yourselves you still have date night, and technically, you do. It just mostly involves logistics, a dying phone, and someone saying the word deck 3 times before the appetizers arrive. You are 2 people on a date, discussing the operations of the company you accidentally became. He is not, statistically, an outlier in the worst way. Only about 11% of American workers put in more than 50 hours a week, which means he is rare, special, chosen, all the words he likes. It also means you are in a small club of people quietly eating dinner alone in nice kitchens. America makes this easy for him. The US is the only advanced economy with no federal law guaranteeing paid vacation or sick leave. So there is nothing. No law, no custom, no culture, gently suggesting he stop. The average American gets roughly 10 vacation days a year, and he uses his to check email somewhere with a better view. Statista +2. You used to find this impressive. The man who never logs off. Then you notice that never logs off and never fully arrives are the same sentence wearing different suits. So you adapt. You move dinner to 9. You learn to fall asleep to the blue glow of him answering, "Just one more thing." You become fluent in the specific silence of a man who is in the room but filed elsewhere. You're not lonely, you're scheduled. There's a difference, and you can no longer remember what it is. 2. The third person in the bed has a LinkedIn. The economist Claudia Goldin has a name for what's eating your marriage. She calls it greedy work, and she won a Nobel Prize for explaining it, which is more recognition than the dynamic gets in most households. Greedy work is the kind of job that rewards total availability, long hours, no limits, always on call, and pays more than proportionally for it. Work 60 hours instead of 30, and you don't earn twice as much. You earn more than twice as much. The math is seductive and the math is cruel, because once that's true, somebody in the couple is going to chase it. And the person who chases it can't also be the person who remembers the dentist appointment. So a deal gets struck. Goldin found that couples quietly choose between a marriage of equals and a marriage with more money. And most of them, without ever saying it at the altar, pick the money. One of you goes on call at the office, the other goes on call at home. One partner loses the income and the promotions, the other loses the hours of their own life. Guess which role drifted to you? You didn't sign up to be infrastructure, but infrastructure is what holds the impressive thing up, and nobody photographs the foundation. The cruelest part is that his absence has excellent branding. An affair would at least be embarrassing for him. This isn't. This gets him praised. He is providing. He is grinding. He is building something for the family. The family that is, at this exact moment, watching a movie without him and pausing it at the parts he'd like. You're not losing him to another woman. You're losing him to a quarterly target, and unlike a mistress, the quarter always comes back. 3. The second shift. Nobody asked you to work. While he is being magnificent at the office, an entire invisible job opens up at home, and it has your name on it by default. You become the one who knows where the passports are, the one who remembers his mother's birthday and signs both names, the one tracking the pediatrician, the plumber, the permission slip, the slowly dying smoke detector battery chirping a complaint only you can hear. None of this is in your job description, because there is no job description. There's just a vacancy, and you were standing closest to it. The data is almost rude about how predictable you are. Across a decade of North American studies, women do a median of 64% of the housework. Married women without children do more than twice the household work of their male counterparts, about 14 hours a week to his 6. And the part that should be illegal. On days off, fathers were found doing leisure nearly half the time their partners were doing childcare. He rests in the same house where you are working a shift that has no clock out. You'd love to be angry, but anger requires energy, and you've allocated yours. He doesn't see it, and that's almost worse than if he refused to. He genuinely believes the house runs itself, the way people believe the sun comes up on its own. The running of it is the labor he's not counting. When you mention it, he says he'd help if you just told him what to do. Generously offering to become a second manager of a household, you are already exhausted from running, as long as you handle the management. So you stop asking. You file it under faster to do it myself, which is the 4-word epitaph of a marriage where one person's time is treated as priceless and the other's as merely free. You're not his partner anymore. You're his operating system, and he's amazed by how smoothly everything runs. 4. The loneliness that has a great address. There's a particular loneliness available only to people who are technically not alone. You have a husband. You have his name in your phone, his coat in the closet, his half of a bed that stays cool until midnight. You are surrounded by the evidence of a relationship and starved of the experience of one. This is the loneliness you can't complain about, because the moment you try, someone reminds you he's a good provider, as if provision and presence were the same nutrient. The research is quietly devastating here. Women partnered to men who work 50 or more hours a week report significantly higher stress, less adequate time together, and lower relationship quality than women whose partners work a standard week. And here's the detail that should be printed on wedding invitations. It isn't mainly the lost hours that damage the relationship. It's the stress. The stress is what bleeds through. He doesn't just take his absence home. He takes his pressure home and unpacks it onto the one person contractually obligated to be there. The damage is also a slow leak, not a flood. Over the first 4 years of marriage, partners of high workload spouses show steadily greater declines in satisfaction. And it doesn't matter your gender or whether you have kids. It just accrues, like interest on a loan you didn't know you co-signed. There's an old cutting way therapists describe it. The spouse of a workaholic often experiences the work itself as a kind of infidelity. The feeling of being chosen second, every single day, by someone who would be hurt if you called it that. You can't catch him cheating because his other relationship files taxes, so you build a life sideways. Friends, the kids, a show he'll never watch, a version of yourself that doesn't require his attention to exist, which is healthy and adaptive, and also the exact moment a marriage quietly becomes 2 people sharing a Wi-Fi password. You stopped waiting up. You'd call that healing if you weren't so sure it was just surrender with better posture. 5. The statistic you try not to be. There's a number you found once, late at night, doing the kind of search you delete from your history out of loyalty. Couples where one partner is a workaholic divorce at a rate around 40% higher than couples where neither one overworks. You read it twice. Not because it surprised you, because it didn't. It felt less like a warning and more like a weather report for a storm already in the house. What the number doesn't capture is how reasonable the slide feels from the inside. Nobody throws a plate. There's no scene. Workaholism is rarely just ambition. It's often a place to hide, a zone where the rules are clear, and a man feels competent in a way he doesn't always feel across a dinner table. The office never tells him he's distant. The spreadsheet never asks how he's really doing. Of course he'd rather be there. There, he's winning. So the fights, when they come, are small and strange. You're not fighting about the affair because there isn't one. You're fighting about the airport pickup, the forgotten thing, the "I told you about this weeks ago," which is technically true and emotionally a lie, because telling you in passing while answering Slack is not the same as being a person who shows up. The arguments are never about what they're about. They're about a man who keeps choosing, gently, politely, and the woman who keeps noticing she's the runner-up in her own marriage. And then you both go back to acting normal. That's the part nobody warns you about. Not the conflict, but the recovery. The way you reset to pleasant. The way the system reabsorbs the rupture and resumes, calendar intact. You're not headed for an explosion, you're headed for an erosion. Those don't make a sound. 6. Why you stay anyway? Here's the question everyone's too polite to ask and too curious not to wonder. So why don't you leave? Because it's not all performance. That's why. He texts from the airport that he wishes he were home, and the maddening thing is he means it. He's good with the kids in the 90 concentrated minutes he gets them. He remembers sometimes, at exactly the right moment, the thing you mentioned once. And it undoes you, because it proves he was listening, which means the absence was a choice, which means the presence is too. You don't stay despite the glimpses, you stay for them. Hope is a renewable resource, unfortunately. And then there's the arithmetic, which America made sure you'd feel. The greedy job that stole him also built the life. The disproportionate paycheck that comes from being always available. Leaving doesn't just cost you a husband, it costs you the house, the schools, the version of stability that took a decade to assemble. You pick the marriage with more money, and the bill for that choice comes due quietly, in the currency of being known. So you stay, and you renegotiate the terms downward, year by year, until "I'd settle for him being present" becomes "I'd settle for him being pleasant," becomes a kind of peace you'd be embarrassed to describe to your younger self. You call it maturity. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just a hostage learning the guard's schedule. The truth is you didn't lose him to a woman, or a vice, or a sudden betrayal you could point to. You lost him to a culture that handed a man a watch the day he was born and told him his worth would be measured in what he produced before it stopped. He answered the call. He's still answering it. You just happened to be standing next to the phone. You wanted to be his life. You settled for being his home address. And in America, somehow, that still counts as a success story. The marriage isn't dead. It's just being kept alive by routine, shared bills, and the fact that he genuinely loves you. In the time he has left over, which he keeps promising, with total sincerity, will be more next quarter. It's always next quarter. That's the thing about marrying a man whose career comes first. He's not going to leave you. He just already did, slowly, with great success, and sent a very thoughtful gift to apologize for missing it.